They are your election headquarters, and the battle for the NPP's top spot, the flag bearer to lead the party into the 2028 election, is heating up with less than 4 days to go to the polls. According to results from 8 polls tracked by JoyNews Research here in the JoyNews channel, Dr. Bawumia is currently leading with 46%, followed closely by Kennedy Agyapong, who's standing at 38%. But here's the twist. A significant number of delegates are still undecided, making this a potentially explosive contest. For more insights on this, I'm joined in the studio by Kofi Eji. He's our lead data analyst here at JoyNews. Kofi, you've been doing your diggings. Yeah. Let's start with the very top, some of the polls we gathered and did our assessment. What did we find?
In the U.S., one thing that's very important during election polling, season is what we call poll aggregator. Poll aggregator essentially will sample relevant polls on a particular topic or election, issue that we want to poll about. And what they do is that they aggregate all the results and try to use statistical models and averages to possibly understand the polling environment in a 360 manner. So that's what we did. And what we did in terms of the NPP's 2026 presidential primary is to sample data from 8 polls that we've been tracking since the beginning of the year or since last year. And in fact, one thing you will realize per what we have done is that in terms of the 8 polls that we have sampled, together the pollsters actually spoke to over 140,000 delegates. And we understand that this particular election, about over 200,000 delegates will be voting across the length and breadth of the country, and that's what we are checking, for you. So all the 8 polls we've tracked so far, they claim they've spoken to more than over 140,000. You can make a point that there are delegates who are possibly spoken to more than once, but the number there on the smart wall is 140,000 delegates who have been spoken to in this 8 polls. So one thing you realize is that if we are able to use big number, it gives us, some bit of significant, outlook in terms of how the election is going to pan out. So let's go ahead. In terms of the 8 polls that we sampled, right, you agree with me that, global info analytics should be first in terms of recency, regularity, and all of that, because they poll almost regularly, more than any other polling, institution we find here. In terms of global info analytics, what we did was that we sampled from 3 of their most recent, polls: 3 from global info analytics, 3 from Sanity Africa Foresee, 1 from Africa Policy Lens, and 1 from one individual doctor.
Okay. And Kofi, we would come to the other ones. We just want to address a little challenge we're facing with your mic. That will be addressed shortly, and then we'll delve right into it. So based on what you're telling us, the number of polls considered for this research that we did here at JoyNews, we sampled some from Global Info Analytics, from Sanity Africa. Sanity Africa and Global Info Analytics, they've done 3 different polls so far, all picturing what we should expect in the upcoming polls for the NPP flag bearership race. We also know that Africa Policy Lens, they've also conducted a survey as well, and then Dr. Evans conducted one as well. So out of all these individuals, they tell us that they sampled some cumulative number of 140,000 people. And Kofi, you're back with us. Walk us through the numbers.
So let's use this to actually answer certain questions. So in terms of the poll aggregator that we are talking about, what we did was that we added all the results, tried to use averaging models to see where each of the candidates are actually standing in terms of the 8 polls. So per the 8 polls that we have sampled, which you have actually walked us through, what we realized after our computation and research is that Dr. Bawumia is leading, but not leading with more than 50%, but leading with 45.86%. So we say roughly 45.9% for Bawumia. Kennedy Agyapong, on the other hand, is chasing Dr. Bawumia with about 37%. Brian Agyapong, 50.64%. Dr. Educhum is around 2%. And Kennedy Agyapong, 1%. And you still have a significant number, with about 8% who still remain undecided.
And that 8%, should it even swing towards Kennedy Agyapong? Would that influence the outcome of Dr. Bawumia's election?
Exactly. If you add 8 to 37, definitely you see that pushes Kennedy Agyapong's number higher than that of Dr. Bawumia. But definitely what we're estimating is that we don't expect one person to take all 8%.
Yeah,
it all depends on
exactly
evenly,
most likely
across all maybe 5 candidates. But one thing we see here is that, well, if you look at this 37%, it's around the same figure that Kennedy Agyapong actually got 2 years ago in the 2023 primaries, and that is similar to what the averager is talking about. But in terms of Dr. Bawumia, what you see is that his average is actually below what he had in 2023. We'll go ahead to look at, out of the 8 polls, which of them is predicting a win for Dr. Bawumia, which one is predicting a win for Kennedy Agyapong, because it looks like the race is between the two of them. But I'll tell you the story of the third force in the person of Dr. Brian Agyapong and why he's so important, even though all the polls are actually pointing out to Dr. Bawumia and Kennedy Agyapong. So out of the 8, 4 of the polls are actually predicting a win for Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia. And in fact, out of that 4, 3 is actually coming from Global Info Analytics. 3 of the polls coming from Global Info Analytics. And Kennedy Agyapong, actually Sanity Africa, and one other poll is predicting 4. So split out of the 8 we studied, 4 wins for Bawumia, 4 predicting a win for Bawumia, 4 also predicting a win for Dr. Kennedy Agyapong. But in terms of comparing the poll, the average for each of the candidates, in terms of the 2 leading candidates, to where each of the pollsters want them to be or expecting them to be, according to the data that they have, look at Dr. Bawumia's average from the aggregator that we put together. His average is around 45.86%. But in terms of Global Info Analytics, their latest poll is predicting or is forecasting some 48% for him. That is about 2 percentage points or 1.2 percentage points higher than our averager. If you go to Sanity Africa, they expect Bawumia to actually be below 40%. If you compare 40% to where the averager is showing you 45%, so that will mean that they are predicting a proportion which is about, let's say, 5 percentage points below where Bawumia is currently looking at the averager. If you go to Africa Policy Lens, which is also predicting a win for Dr. Bawumia, is around 63.8%. That's a vast difference between where, Africa Policy Lens is expecting Dr. Bawumia to be versus what the averager is actually saying. So right from the onset, what you see is that this is purely an outlier in terms of where the average is and where Africa Policy Lens expect Bawumia to be. But this is research, is surveys, polling, anything can actually happen. This is one outlier in terms of Dr. Evans Diaz's prediction. He expects Dr. Bawumia in terms of his poll to be around 36%, although the averager is showing some 45.86%. So let's do the same for Kennedy Agyapong in terms of where the polls expect him to be and where the averager is actually putting him. The averager, correct number, is putting him somewhere around 37.93%, almost about 38% win. That is about 1 percentage point higher than what he polled in 2023 when he came against Bawumia in December. Now, the Global Info Analytics, which is not predicting a win for Kennedy Agyapong, is expecting him to be around 25%, which is miles away from where the averager is putting him. If you look at Sanity Africa, and this is also an outlier. We saw one outlier for Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia, which is Africa Policy Lens. If you come to Kennedy Agyapong, it's the same thing. We see one outlier in the institution of Sanity Africa, who are predicting a 52% win according to their latest poll for Kennedy Agyapong, but the averager is putting him around some 38%. Africa Policy Lens is also putting Kennedy Agyapong around 29%, roughly, which is woefully below the 37.9%. And you see Dr. Evans Diaz, who is predicting Bawumia to be around below somewhere 40% or 36%, is predicting a win for Kennedy Agyapong about 47%. So this is what the averager is actually saying. But we say that everything is going to boil down to this 8% who remain undecided, because the polls are saying otherwise. But this 8% of delegates, there are over 20,000, 200,000 delegates who currently do not know where to place their votes. To be able to convince them will be very, very important.
So based on what we know so far, it's going to be largely a two-horse race, would it not?
Looks like a two-horse race for Steve, but the third horse is going to be Dr. Brian Agyapong, because this data will tell you this is actual data from the 2023 presidential election, where Bawumia polled 61%, Kennedy Agyapong 37%, which is not so far from where the average is expecting him to be. Bawumia far off from where the average is expecting him to be. Efri Yakuto 0.7%, Adainimo 0.4%. What you see is that this time around, there is a strong third force in the person of Dr. Brian Agyapong, who people are predicting, analysts are predicting, could possibly eat from Bawumia's cake or Kennedy Agyapong's cake. And you also have Dr. Yao Duchum, strong force, Kennedy Agyapong, strong force. All of them, the three of them combined, is what we call the combined third force in this race, which we are projecting could pose any form of upset or possibly to Dr. Bawumia, Kennedy Agyapong, or anybody who possibly will come even third. And so it is not a done deal yet, but based on what we are looking at, it's going to be closely contested. That is what the polls are telling us. We'll keep, tracking all the polls. We are going to do a new one, which will possibly use statistical models to actually test where the averages are versus where, we all expect them to be. Testing the central tendency of these candidates in terms of the polls we've seen so far, comparing them to what they actually got in 2023. So far, this is what the polls are saying.
Quite interesting data
that
we have there.
Averager is pointing to 45.8% for Bawumia, 37% or 38% for Kennedy Agyapong, 5.64% for Brian Agyapong, 2% for Educhum, 1% for Kennedy Agyapong, still 8% remain
undecided. And they are actually what I call the determining factor if we look at the race. And it's something we should look forward to. But we are your election headquarters, and we'll be covering the NPP's internal race closely on Saturday. So you should stick and stay with us here on the JoyNews channel.